All right, welcome back, everybody, and thanks for your patience. It fortunately was a very short delay, and I'm thrilled and honored to introduce our next guest in our discussion here on day two, back to State of the World 2021 at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. And it's my distinct honor to introduce Senator Ben Cardin, who is a Democrat from Delaware, the senior senator from Maryland, first elected to that seat in 2006 and previously served as U.S. Representative in Maryland's 3rd Congressional District from 1987 to 2007. And I also want to mention that he has been a longtime member and chair of the Helsinki Commission. And I had the privilege of serving on that, representing the executive branch when I served in the State Department. And also when I was at Freedom House, we gave Senator Cardin our Leadership Award, along with Senator McCain and several others, for his tremendous leadership in getting the Magnitsky legislation passed in 2012. Senator Cardin, it's a great thrill to see you again and have you here. Thanks so much for taking time out of an incredibly busy schedule. I think you're going to make some opening comments, as I understand it, and then I'll let Jonathan Tepperman take over, who will moderate from there. But if you want to go ahead, Senator, just for a few minutes, that would be great.
Well, David, let me say a few nice words about you. Thank you very much for your extraordinary leadership on the strength of America, because you understand that America's strength is in our values. Your participation on the Helsinki Commission, which you have done in regards to international democracy building, is really very much understood, and thank you for that record. And I really appreciate that you're having this forum dealing with the struggle of democracy and no letting up. So let me take you back to January 6th, if you don't think we're struggling. I was in the United States Senate on the floor when the rioters were knocking on our door, and we were literally in harm's way. And yes, so we were all concerned about our personal safety on January 6th. We never thought we would see an insurrection in America. We thought that our institutions were so stable that no one would dare challenge the institution of Congress when it's carrying out its constitutional function. So I was more concerned about the safety of our democracy than I was about the safety of my own personal safety. But then 2 weeks later, on January 20th, I was on the west front of the Capitol, where the rioters had penetrated just 2 weeks earlier, celebrating the peaceful transition of power with Democrats and Republicans. It was the day to celebrate that our democratic system held. But we do see a troubling trend around the world. This is nothing new. It didn't just happen in the last 4 years. It's been for the last couple of decades. We've seen a decline of democracies, and we've seen a decline within democratic states of democratic principles, including in the United States. So this is a very troubling sign and something we really need to take a look at and pay attention to. We also see a rise of nationalism, which has been equated to hate and the development of hate against people who are different, whether it's by race, religion, ethnic background, and it's caused a lot of violence. So that the FBI tells us now that the greatest fear towards domestic violence is coming from within and not from external terrorists. These are all issues that we have to really be concerned about. We celebrated just a couple decades ago the fall of the Soviet Union, and we celebrated all the countries under the domination of the Soviet Union moving towards democracy. And I remember when we had the Paris meeting of the Helsinki group in 1990, and we celebrated the fact that all the member states were moving towards being democratic states, and we adopted that as our principle. Look how we have changed since 1990. We had NATO allies that are questionable as to their commitment to democracy. Look what's happening in Turkey. Look what's happening in Hungary. Look what's happening in other countries as we see a decline of democratic values. So these discussions are critically important, and that's why I wanted to participate. I can tell you, I appreciate you mentioning Senator McCain. The two of us recognized a long time ago that in order to strengthen America, we needed to strengthen American values. And that's why we took up the cause of the Magnitsky sanctions, to make it clear first to Russia, but then to all countries of the world, that America will stand by its values and that we will punish individuals who violate basic international standards of human rights if their host country does not take up accountability. And we expanded it to corruption because we think corruption is one of the greatest cancers we have towards democracy today, a rise of corruption around the entire world. And that's why Senator Young and I have introduced legislation in this Congress to set up a tiered system of rating every country in the world on how well they're fighting corruption. So there's a lot of things we can do together, and I look forward to this discussion, and I very much appreciate everything you're doing to defend American values and America's strength globally.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to join in now. I'm Jonathan Tepperman, the editor of Foreign Policy Magazine. It's an honor to be speaking to you. I want to start by picking up on some of the things you just said. Let's begin with your comments about the United States, especially given the events that you experienced personally on January 6th. How worried are you about the state of democracy at home right now? And what are the key things you think we need to do to rebuild after 4 years of Trump?
Well, I am concerned. It's not just the fringe element that believes that our democratic system failed in this past election, that the election was stolen. We have a large number of Americans who have accepted the lies being told to them by President Trump and his supporters. And that erodes the confidence in our democratic institutions. And when you don't have confidence that the democratic institutions are working properly, then you can see violence. And we saw violence in this country on January 6th, and we continue to see the signs of violence. So yes, I am concerned about this. And I really do believe we have to work on it. Quite frankly, we have the right person in the White House, not because he's a Democrat, because Joe Biden understands the importance of democratic institutions. He understands the importance of representing all Americans. So I think we have the right leader in the White House at this particular time to deal with these issues. He'll restore America's leadership globally by how we behave and how we promote democratic values here in the United States. But I am concerned, and we have a lot of healing we need to do, and we have a real task in order to inform the public as to how our democratic institutions work and to get them information so they can make their own judgments and not be misled by the statements that were said by the previous administration.
And how important a part of that process is the impeachment trial, do you think?
Well, the impeachment trial is an indication that no one's above the law. And we've heard over and over again, the only way you can hold accountable a sitting president for his misconduct is through the impeachment process. And the misconduct occurred while President Trump was in office. So we don't have any alternative but to pursue the articles of impeachment. The House felt they had no alternative because that's the only way they could hold the president accountable for his incitement for the rioters coming into the Capitol. The Senate has no choice because once articles of impeachment are brought to us, we have to conduct a trial. Our rules require that. So we will start the trial on February the 8th. And the bottom line is those who entered the Capitol and caused destruction and harm and cost life, they need to be held accountable. And those responsible for inciting the insurrection also need to be held accountable, whether it's the president of the United States or whomever. So it's a necessary component. We have to deal with this. We really can't look at the political consequences. We have to look at the fact of justice, and anyone responsible for the insurrection needs to be held accountable.
The problem, of course, is that the impeachment trial will not be a truly judicial process. It'll be a political one. Do you worry about the message it will send if the Senate fails to convict?
I am concerned about it because I would like to bring closure. It'd be one thing if the Senate was really divided as to the president's culpability, but I'm afraid there may be some senators who vote against conviction on a process issue as to whether a former president can be held responsible during an impeachment trial. We saw a test vote of that last week in the Senate. So I am concerned it may not bring closure, and I would like to see the Senate go on record about the president's conduct. Now, I don't want to prejudge the trial, but we do know what the president said to incite the the crowd to come down to the Capitol, and there needs to be accountability for that conduct.
Now, as you said, the Biden administration faces tremendous challenges in the sense that it has to deal with democratic erosion at home and abroad, and the onslaught of authoritarian and ethno-nationalist regimes around the world. Is there a sequencing issue here as you see it? In other words, is the damage that's been done here so bad that the United States needs to get its own house in order before it starts working abroad, or can it afford to do both? And will it have the credibility and the legitimacy to try and do both simultaneously?
We don't have the luxury of time to sequence. The coup in Burma has taken place. We have to respond. The United States took action to try to encourage the civilian control of Burma. We reduced the sanctions, and we gave legitimacy, including a presidential visit, in an effort to advance democracy in Burma. We now see the military has taken a coup, ousting the civilian leader, and that needs our response. So President Biden needs to respond, and Congress needs to respond to what's happening in Burma. We have the circumstances concerning Iran, the fact that the US was isolated under President Trump's policy by pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement. That's an issue that requires urgent attention to get Iran back in compliance with their nuclear obligations and to deal with their non-nuclear violations, including the support of terrorism. That requires the United States to engage first our traditional partners, but also Russia and China. And then, of course, we have the problem of Venezuela that can't wait. It's causing not only a misery and humanitarian disaster in that immediate region, but also pressure on migration to other countries, including the United States. And then throw in China and Russia. So the president needs to be engaged in the global leadership of the United States, but at the same time, he must repair the damage that's been done here in the United States. We have to lead by example, and we have to show the world that we not only preach our values, we live by our values. And these values are universal values, including the protection of democratic institutions. So we have to do both.
I want to remind our audience that although we don't have much time for this session, we're hoping to take a few questions at the end, especially if you're an FIU student. So please send them in over the Q&A function. Senator, you just mentioned Russia. What do you make of the recent protests there? Do you expect them to continue or to fizzle out as they so often have in Russia's recent past due to intense state suppression?
I know that there's been a great deal of energy by the people of Russia against the Putin policies. And the most recent example of imprisoning Mr. Navalny, just because he's the opposition to Putin, is outrageous. And yes, the United States needs to take action against Russia, including additional sanctions. But we also need to support the ability of Russian population to peacefully protest against what Mr. Putin is doing. So it's our hope that Mr. Putin will change course, that he will release Mr. Navalny safely, and that he recognizes that he has a commitment to the people of Russia to allow them to choose their leadership and to participate in their government.
So as I understand it, the Russian government just today has sentenced Navalny to 2.5 years in prison. What would you like to see the United States do to help? What can we do that could make a difference? Both Navalny and a group of opposition figures, including Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Garry Kasparov, have recently called on Washington to target Putin's assets and those of his oligarchs to really get them where it counts. Are those the kind of measures you would support?
Absolutely. Remember, they didn't just imprison Mr. Navalny, they poisoned him and tried to kill him. So what Mr. Putin is doing is so far off the range as far as acceptable conduct. And yes, if we've seen in the summit meeting between President Trump and Mr. Putin that the Magnitsky sanctions were top on Mr. Putin's list. So let's use the Magnitsky sanctions and go after those individuals that were responsible for the mistreatment of Mr. Navalny. It's interesting, the Magnitsky sanctions are named after Sergei Magnitsky, who was a lawyer representing a client who found corruption, reported to the government. As a result, he was imprisoned, tortured, and killed. And as a result of his tragedy, we were able to get first specific sanctions against Russia and then global sanctions on individuals who commit these atrocities. So let's use the Magnitsky sanctions to go against those responsible for the Navalny mistreatment. That will freeze their financial ability to do business in other countries, and it will prevent them from traveling. The good news is the United States is not alone on Magnitsky. The EU has just passed a Magnitsky statute. We have the Baltic countries have passed Magnitsky. Canada has passed Magnitsky. So we have a web of countries that can really make an impact on the oligarchs that support Mr. Putin's corruption.
And that raises another issue I should ask you about, which is the role of international cooperation as the United States pushes back on various countries, whether it's China, Russia, Myanmar, and so on. Of course, the state of America's alliances is pretty ragged right now after 4 years of Trump. What can Biden do to improve them and to reassemble the kind of coalition quickly to provide the kind of quick, united action that's necessary?
Well, quite frankly, I think Mr. President Biden's already taken the right first steps. That is his language, what he says. He believes in these coalitions. Mm-hmm. He believes that we have to work with our partners, particularly our traditional partners, that we have to engage the international community. So he's going to reverse the actions that President Biden took to remove America from the Paris climate agreements. He's going to reverse the steps taken by Mr. Trump to remove us from the World Health Organization. He's going to reverse the steps taken in regards to pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement. He's going to reverse a lot of the steps taken on the trade agenda where the United States went by itself. He's going to support NATO, not just by words, but by deeds, to let our traditional allies know that we are back. And I must tell you, I've talked to a lot of our colleagues in Europe and our traditional partners. They were looking forward to this day. And they're open with an embrace for America to return to its traditional position as the leader in regards to democratic countries.
How much bipartisan support do you see or agreement in the Senate for taking united action on these issues?
Well, on the foreign policy agenda, I think there's a great deal of bipartisan support. I mean, we saw that on the Magnitsky sanctions that we imposed. Let me be clear about this. When I first proposed the Magnitsky sanction law, it was not embraced by the Obama administration. It was looked upon as interfering with executive diplomacy. So I must tell you, there's a consistency among administrations against Congress taking direct action in regards to foreign policy. But Democrats and Republicans are anxious to get involved. We're the ones who passed the sanction regimes against Iran that brought them to the negotiating table in regards to the nuclear agreement. We're the ones that imposed sanctions against so many countries, including what we're doing with, in Venezuela, what we have done in China, and what we've done in other parts of the world. We have passed bipartisan, almost always bipartisan legislation to reinforce America's values. And quite frankly, it works to the advantage of the administration, because with separation of the branches of government here in America, the administration can very well say, look, Congress speaks towards the policy of this country. They are demanding that we deal with human rights as part of our foreign policy agenda, that we deal with democratic institutions and a right for people to be heard, and the right for an independent investigative press, so that the administration can use that to advance American values, using Congress as leverage to get things done.
And do you feel that Congress can continue to function in this sort of a two-track mode where, on the one hand, on domestic issues, it seems to be becoming more polarized than ever, and yet still find ways to set that enmity aside when it comes to foreign policy?
I really do. I do think on foreign policy is an area where we can bring Democrats and Republicans together. It doesn't mean we won't have a different perspective. We probably will in regards to Iran and the president's decision to withdraw from the nuclear agreement. We may have some differences in regards to climate issues, but generally in regards to national security issues, one thing's going to change immediately under the Biden administration. We're going to get unfettered access to the intelligence information. So we all will be working with the same set of information, something that has always been done traditionally, except under the Trump administration. So we'll be in that classified setting in getting information. And I think when we share that information, we tend to come together for our national security, and we recognize that we need to put the nation first. And I've seen that happen over and over again as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I must tell you, I am very confident that we're going to be able to work together on foreign policy challenges.
Well, that's great to hear. Okay, we have some student questions coming in now, and I have to warn you, they're much tougher than mine were, so be ready.
Sure.
Max Ulloa is a senior studying international relations at FIU. He thanks you for being here, and he points out that next door to Russia, Belarus has been going through protests of its own in the aftermath of an election that most states have recognized as fraudulent. What can the Senate or the administration do to place more pressure on the Belarusian government under Lukashenko and on Russia, which is their key supporter?
Well, you know, President Lukashenko has been president of Belarus for a very long period of time. He rules the country under a total autocratic system. There is really no democratic elections in that country or democratic protections in that country. He has done things at times that are very irrational. It's a situation where we did come together in the last election and declared it not to be a free and fair election. And we did encourage the people of Belarus to allow for free and fair elections. Quite frankly, we even had Russia on our side. Russia has its problems with Belarus, even though they are allies. Belarus is an unpredictable ally of Russia. So it's a country that desperately needs a new president. Lukashenko should have gone a long time ago. And the country desperately needs to build up democratic institutions and allow the people's voices to be heard and have a free and fair election.
Great, thank you. Now on to Teresa Cardin, who's a political science student at FIU. She points out that you've advocated for improved healthcare for Americans throughout your time in the Senate. With the current pandemic, we now see how important such healthcare is, but we also see how important it is to make the effort a global one, since what happens with the pandemic, and we're seeing this now in Europe, which is struggling to vaccinate its citizens, and in the developing world, which has barely started. All of that has implications for global trade, which could redound on the US economy, and for security, but also for Americans' own health, given that the longer the virus is allowed to grow unchecked around the world, the greater the odds that it will continue to mutate in ways that make it harder to fight. That was my gloss. I'll return to her question now. She's wondering, how can the United States work with other countries to improve access to healthcare worldwide and make this part of our core foreign policy?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for that. We're not safe from the pandemic unless the global community is safe from the pandemic. We've got to control it from a global point of view. So it's in our health interests to deal with this pandemic on a global scale. Make no mistake about it, the United States has been very actively engaged in global health issues. Under the USAID, we provide substantial help globally to deal with challenges on the health front. Probably the best example I could give you was the PEPFAR program under President Reagan, which set up our commitment to try to end HIV/AIDS. And at the time that came about, I think most people thought that was a pipe dream, couldn't happen. But in reality, we gave consequential aid to a significant number of countries that developed a healthcare system that contained HIV/AIDS and has saved literally hundreds of thousands of lives, maybe millions of lives. So we can make a consequential difference when we really put our efforts behind it. So in President Biden's COVID relief package, he has $10 billion in it to provide international help in regards to the global pandemic of COVID-19. So we do need to look at consequential changes. It's not just providing them with the vaccine distribution or the number of vaccines that they need. They need to have in country the capacity to deal with a healthcare challenge. Today it's COVID-19. Yesterday it might have been HIV/AIDS. Tomorrow it may be something else. We need to be able to, we have to build up the capacity in the country to have the infrastructure to provide for the healthcare needs of its citizens. And in so many countries around the world, they really don't have that capacity. And that's where the United States, I think, can come in and play a major role.
Mm-hmm. Jessica Armato, another student, asks about Venezuela. What are the options there for smart sanctions or what have you, given that Russia, China, and others are aligned with and supporting the Maduro regime?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's no answer that I know of, no easy answer. You know, when it first started, I heard from experts in this country that all we had to do was support the opposition, and the people of Venezuela, knowing their history, would embrace this, and Maduro would be gone in a short period of time. Well, that was years ago, and we've seen this linger on. I heard the same thing in Syria about dealing with the Assad regime, that we could find a way to deal with that situation. My point is this: the longer this goes on, the more difficult it is for us to deal with it. It's no longer just the Maduro regime. You have a criminal element that has taken over a large part of the control of Venezuela for their criminal enterprise. And it presents a real serious problem. I talked about corruption before. Venezuela is now one of the most corrupt countries in the world. So it's going to be a challenge to rebuild that country where democratic institutions can survive. So we have been successful in isolating Venezuela, but not as much as we need to. We should be able to use the Organization of American States more effectively than we have. And that means we have to spend more time on diplomacy, particularly among the smaller states in our hemisphere, so we have more support in isolating the support for the Maduro regime. The bottom line is we have to use a combination of incentives and penalties to get Venezuela back on track. And we need at the same time to find an effective way to deliver humanitarian assistance. There is a humanitarian crisis within the country that is horrible. It's in our hemisphere. We have to be one of the leaders in finding a way to deliver humanitarian assistance. We also need to deal with the realities of migration. So many Venezuelans have left the country. They're now in Colombia, causing a real problem in Colombia's pathway towards reform. And there are many other countries that are directly impacted by it. So it does require an all-out effort, and it really does require us to invest more resources in a dual path, one, a penalty path against the regime, but also one that helps the people of Venezuela through these troubling times.
You know, your answer raises an interesting question about trade-offs, because as you point out, we need to work with the countries that surround Venezuela, including some of its friends and partners, if we're going to make progress there. So let's take Cuba, for example. Cuba is instrumental to propping up the Maduro regime. On the other hand, Cuba is a government with a regime with its own enormous human rights problems, and not one that we may want to do business with under ordinary circumstances. But do we need to in this case? Do we need to set aside our reservations, or at least find a way of both sanctioning Cuba and making clear our objections, but working with them? And you could say the same about, of course, there are many related issues when it comes to China and even Russia, who we can't
Certainly
afford to simply stop talking to.
Certainly, we need to engage as many countries, if not all the countries in the world. We need to have relations, even with countries that are our enemies, even with countries that we have strong disagreements with. But it always needs to be wrapped within our values. We should never compromise American values or compromise raising issues with these countries to advance American objectives. So we always really need to have a smart relationship. Cuba is our close neighbor. So it's critically important that we have a relationship with Cuba. Cuba is a communist country. It's a country that has major abuses of human rights, and we need to call that out. I'll always remember my first planned trip to Cuba several years ago, when I was going down to try to establish some contact with the Cuban government, and their representative in the United States came into my office and wanted to see my itinerary, who I wanted to visit with. And I gave him my itinerary. And then he says, well, you shouldn't meet with this person and that person. I said, well, I'm going to meet with them. He said, well, you're not going to get a visa then. I said, okay, I'm not going to let you dictate who I can meet with if I come to your country. So it's that mentality that exists in Cuba that is totally against what we believe in as a nation. So we always got to stay true to our principles. You're exactly right. Cuba is interfering in a big way in Venezuela and are calling a lot of the shots in Venezuela. So we need to make that as uncomfortable as possible for Cuba. But on the other hand, it doesn't help us in our hemispheric politics to isolate America from Cuba. We have to recognize that Cuba is a dominant player in the Western Hemisphere, and we need to make sure that we can deal with that. And the way to deal with that is to develop relations with the country. That started under the Obama administration. It was chilled under the Trump administration. And I'm closer to the Obama policies that I think are right than the Trump policies, but I think we have to be tough with Cuba.
So we're already in extra minutes now. That's a soccer metaphor, but I think because we're based in Florida, I can afford to make that. I see David's popped up. Do I have time for another question, or are we calling it? Okay, one more, he says. So I want to ask you another question about balancing. Let's take the relationship with China, where we have a huge number of priorities. On the one hand, China is in many ways an adversary and an adversary of our allies, threatening countries in its periphery and in all sorts of ways, engaged in massive hacking against the United States, set in the midst of a trade war against the United States. On the other hand, China remains the United States' largest trade partner, and that is a critical relationship that we can't afford to simply end, no matter what the Trump administration said about it. So how do we balance the priorities when it comes to an issue, say, of the Uyghurs? China is in the middle of this large-scale and hideous cultural genocide against its own population. What can we do about that when we have so many other priorities in our relationship with China?
Well, as I said earlier, we always have to balance our relationship with any country based upon American values and global values. And China is out of the mainstream, out of the norm on so many areas. The way they handle the Uyghurs, their religious persecution, their freedom to their own people, the failure to allow their people to move around in their own country or to attend schools or their occupations. There are significant international standard violations of human rights in China that are reason for America to be concerned. They also cheat. They cheat in commerce. They steal our intellectual property. They try to game the rules for international trade, and they use their size and their market share to try to intimidate countries to play according to their rules, which is a government-controlled economy more so than an open economy that works to the disadvantage of the United States. So we've got to be strong in making it clear to China that they need us. There's no question about it. Our market is critically important to China, and that we need to have a better relationship with China in regards to acceptable international norms. It's not acceptable to steal intellectual property. It's not acceptable to try to use eavesdropping in your commerce to get advantage over America's security. That's not acceptable. We won't let you do those type of cyber attacks. And they have to acknowledge and live by those standards in order to do business with us. Now, we can make a strong case individually, but if we join with our trading partners around the world and they join with us, China is much more likely to respond in a favorable way. So it was a mistake for the United States to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We need to have more relations with market economies and traditional allies as we go in and say, no, it's not going to be China determining the trade rules or the commerce rules in the future. It's going to be the market economy rules that are going to judge how we do business globally. And yes, we are going to continue to raise concerns and hold China accountable with certain penalties if they don't respect basic international human rights. And what they do with the Uyghurs is absolutely outrageous, and we're not going to be quiet about it, and we'll take action against you unless you change your behavior.
Well, Senator, you've said so many important things. I would love to keep asking you more, but I understand you have a fairly important day job to get back to. So we will let you go. Thank you so much for joining us. And
oh, my pleasure. It's a real pleasure. Thank you all for what you're doing. Again, I look forward to continuing this discussion. And I'm sorry I'm not in Florida now because we got snow on the ground here in Maryland and DC. So
hopefully next year, Senator. Thanks so much for joining us. Grateful. Great
David,
to see you again.
Right. Thanks.
Likewise, sir. Thank you, Jonathan. Terrific job. Thank you very much for double duty today. Really appreciate it. Absolutely. And we will be back at 4 o'clock, assuming there's no Senate vote again, with Senator Chris Coons, Democrat from Delaware. So please join us in 19 minutes, hopefully. Thank you.
As a student who is interested in looking to go into politics in the future, having the experience of State of the World is one of the best things that we can get.
So at this event, we will see panelists throughout the 2 days from all walks of life. There are journalists, there are scholars, there are actual diplomats themselves, and they discuss prevalent issues to today's international communities.
Human trafficking is now part of the conversation.
Our original response on the 29th of December to their rocket attacks on us on the 27th of December was absolutely justifiable and right under international law.
I don't think that if you talk to any Democrat, they would tell you that impeachment was good politics for them.
This is an experience that students don't get on a daily basis because despite the fact that you can learn a lot in classes and in lectures, you can't experience having a real-life policymaker, a real-life scientist there in front of you, explaining to you the intricacies of these foreign situations and conflicts.
You've assembled such an amazing group of people here that it's become this sort of meeting place early in the new year. So it's to really become the first conference of the new year.
State of the World proves that every concept we learn in poli-sci courses, in international relations courses, in any one of those social sciences, how they are applicable to real day issues and events that we are seeing.
Hopefully when you leave here today, you'll be enabled to have an even louder voice than you already have.
I think you've really established something here at FIU that you should be very proud of.